Victoria Ashford snatched the microphone from the podium, turned to face a room full of investors and cameras, pointed her finger directly at the man in the dirty maintenance uniform and laughed. Not a polite laugh. A laugh designed to destroy someone in public. The entire room joined her, and Andre Williams just stood there, quiet, still, looking at that $30 million helicopter like he'd seen it before, like he'd flown one before, because he had. And what happened next didn't just silence a room full of powerful people. It changed everything they thought they knew about who deserves to be seen. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it hits you, hit subscribe. This channel is just getting started. The morning it happened, Andre Williams had already been on his feet for 4 hours. He'd shown up at 6 a.m., same as always. Parked his 12-year-old pickup in the farthest corner of the Horizon Aviation lot, the section with the cracked asphalt and the broken light that facilities had been promising to fix for 8 months. He didn't complain about it. He didn't report it. He just parked there, grabbed his toolbox from the bed of the truck, and walked through the side entrance the way he always did. The entrance without a keycard reader. The one that required you to knock and wait for whoever was inside to buzz you in. The entrance that said, without ever putting it in writing, "You are not the kind of person who walks through the front door." Andre had been walking through that side entrance for 3 years. He knew every inch of this facility. He knew which hydraulic lines ran hot in the summer. He knew which rotors vibrated at idle when the starboard seal was degrading. He knew which maintenance logs had been falsified by a previous technician who was fired 6 months before Andre arrived, and whose errors were still quietly embedded in the framework of 3 aircraft that had passed inspection anyway. He'd flagged it once in writing. He'd submitted the report to his shift supervisor, Marcus, who had read it, nodded slowly, and then said something Andre would never forget. "Andre, man, you're not an engineer, you're not a pilot, you're maintenance. You're here to keep things clean and make sure the bolts are where they're supposed to be. Let the people with the degrees worry about the rest." Andre had taken the report back, folded it, put it in his truck, and gone back to work. That was the rhythm of his life here. Show up, do the work, get paid, go home in time to pick up his daughter from school, make dinner, help with homework, fall asleep on the couch reading whatever she'd been assigned that week because she insisted he read alongside her so they could talk about it. Go to bed, wake up, repeat. It was not the life people expected for a man who had once been what he had been. But it was the life he had chosen. And on most days, that was enough. The demonstration was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Andre knew about it the same way he knew about most things at Horizon Aviation, not because anyone told him directly, but because he listened. Because when you are invisible, people forget you're in the room. They talk freely in front of maintenance workers, the way they talk freely in front of furniture. He'd overheard the engineers in the East Bay 3 days earlier. "She's pushing the timeline up again. We're not ready. The vibration issue in the tail rotor hasn't been resolved. I've run the numbers twice." You want to be the one to tell her that? Silence. Then, no. Neither do I. He'd heard the investor list being read aloud by one of the executive assistants in the corridor outside the conference room. 14 names, including 2 former Department of Defense contractors and a senator's brother. He'd heard the catering staff arguing about whether the branded napkins were supposed to say Horizon Aviation or just Horizon, and whether the distinction mattered, and he'd heard one of them say quietly that the only thing that mattered was that the machine flew clean and the people with money left happy. He had not been invited to the demonstration. He was simply scheduled to be in the main hangar doing a routine check on one of the older aircraft parked in the rear. Routine. Invisible. Present. Which meant he would be there when everything went wrong. Victoria Ashford walked into the hangar at exactly 10:17. She was 17 minutes late, which everyone in the room understood was not a mistake. It was a statement. It said, "I do not arrive on your schedule. You wait on mine." She was 43 years old, and she wore authority the way other people wore expensive clothing, naturally, without apparent effort, as though she had been born into it. In some ways, she had been. Her father had run a defense contracting firm. Her mother sat on 2 Fortune 500 boards. Victoria had gone to MIT at 17, Graduated top of her class, built her first company before she was 30, and sold it for enough money that most people would have stopped there. She hadn't stopped. Horizon Aviation was her third company and her most ambitious. It was also, at this particular moment, her most fragile. The investors in the room represented the next round of funding that would determine whether the company remained a promising startup or became something that would reshape the way America thought about private aviation. She needed this to go perfectly. She walked through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing at the right moments, steering conversations with the precision of someone who had practiced this her entire adult life. She wore a charcoal blazer over a white silk blouse, her dark hair pulled back, her smile calibrated warm enough to feel genuine, controlled enough to feel powerful. Andre watched her from the back of the hangar near the older aircraft. He noticed the way she moved through the room. He also noticed the way her eyes shifted when she reached her lead engineer David Chow, a brief flicker of something tight and worried, and then returned immediately to relaxed confidence before anyone else could see it. She knew he realized. She already knew something was wrong. She was going in anyway. The prototype was a thing of genuine beauty, even Andre could admit that. The Horizon Valkyrie, that was what they were calling it, sat in the center of the hangar like something from a future that hadn't arrived yet. Sleek carbon composite shell, custom rotor system, avionics package that was supposed to reduce pilot workload by 40%. The kind of machine that made even experienced people stop and stare. Victoria guided the investors toward it with the confidence of a conductor bringing an orchestra to attention. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're looking at is not just a helicopter, it's the future of rotary aviation. Quieter, faster, safer, and more efficient than anything currently certified for commercial use. We've spent 4 years and $60 million getting her to this point, and today you're going to see her fly. Applause. Andre stayed near the back. I was not supposed to be anywhere near the demonstration area. His work order for the morning was the routine check on Bay 7 200 feet away. But something had kept him lingering. The same instinct that had once kept him lingering before missions, he didn't have a good feeling about. David Chow was standing near the Valkyrie's nose holding a tablet, his jaw set in the way of a man who has already argued and already lost. The demonstration pilot, a man named Tom Reeves, 22 years of experience, former commercial airline captain. The most qualified pilot on Horizon's contracted roster was standing slightly apart from the group, arms crossed, not speaking. That was the thing Andre noticed most. Tom Reeves was not speaking. Tom Reeves, who had more hours in rotary aircraft than most people in this building, had years on Earth, who had the kind of easy, confident presence that pilots developed after years of trusting themselves in the air. Tom Reeves was standing with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and he was not speaking. Andre set down his toolbox. He walked slowly toward the perimeter of the demonstration area. He heard the argument before he reached it. Not an argument exactly, a suppression. The kind of conversation that happens in low voices because the people involved know that what they're saying cannot be said loudly. David's voice tight and controlled. Tom, I understand your concern. I've logged the same concern myself internally. But the decision has been made. Tom's voice, quieter, more dangerous in its quietness. David, the vibration signature in the tail rotor at load exceeds the safety threshold by 11%. That's not a concern. That's a defect. If I put that aircraft into a full power climb in front of this crowd and that rotor develops resonance, it won't. You don't know that. Tom, I've been flying for 22 years, David. I have never not once refused a flight. But I am not getting in that aircraft today. Not with that rotor. Not in front of a crowd. Not when I know what I know. Andre had heard this conversation before. Not these specific words. But this specific shape of conversation, the experienced man saying something is wrong, and the institutional man saying we've already decided. He had heard it before missions that went wrong. He had heard it in debrief rooms afterward, when people tried to explain how the decision had been made, how the warning had been acknowledged and overridden, how the outcome had been foreseeable, and no one had had the authority or the courage to stop it. He had lived the aftermath of those conversations. He did not want to live another one. Victoria was still talking to the investors when Tom Reeves walked up beside her and said something quietly in her ear. The smile didn't leave her face, but something behind her eyes went cold. She turned to him, still smiling, and said with absolute pleasantness, loud enough for the two investors nearest her to hear, "Tom, I appreciate your diligence, but we have guests. This is not the time." "Victoria, I need you to understand." "What I understand," she said, her voice dropping half a degree in temperature while remaining perfectly composed, "is that you have a job. And your job today is to fly this aircraft. That is what you were contracted to do. That is what these people came to see. I won't fly it. Not today. Not with the rotor the way it is." The smile stayed. The eyes did not. "Then you're done. David, please escort Mr. Reeves out and contact our backup pilot." Tom Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at David. Then he uncrossed his arms, picked up his helmet bag from beside the aircraft, and walked out of the hangar. No one spoke. The investors nearest Victoria looked at each other uncertainly. She turned back to them with a laugh that said this was nothing. A minor personnel issue, completely routine. Apologies for the interruption. Our primary pilot is dealing with a personal matter. We have backups for everything. That's how we build our systems at Horizon. Redundancy is built into our DNA. She gestured toward the Valkyrie. "Shall we?" The backup pilot arrived 11 minutes later. He was younger than Tom Reeves, less experienced. He had the kind of energy that reads as confidence from a distance and as something closer to anxiety from up close, if you knew what to look for. Andre watched him do his pre-flight walk-around. He watched the way the pilot's hands moved over the rotor assembly, quickly, efficiently, professionally enough. But not the way a man moves when he has found a problem and is taking his time with it. The way a man moves when he has been told that the decision has already been made. Andre felt something tighten in his chest. He took 3 steps forward without making a decision to do so. And then Victoria Ashford's voice cut through the hangar like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, while we prepare for takeoff, I want to address something. We believe in transparency at Horizon Aviation. We believe that the best way to demonstrate the safety and reliability of our systems is not just through data and simulations, but through live demonstration. Every system on this aircraft has been tested. Every component has been certified. And in a moment, you are going to watch it fly." She was good. Andre could acknowledge that. She was genuinely, extraordinarily good at this. The room was with her. He could feel it the way a crowd's energy shifts when someone with real charisma takes hold of it. The uncertainty that had followed Tom Reeves's exit was already dissolving. And then her gaze swept the room, the casual, practiced sweep of a performer connecting with her audience, and it landed on Andre. On the man in the gray maintenance uniform, standing at the edge of the designated area, with no badge, no credentials, no reason to be there. Her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. Then she smiled. And Andre understood in the way that people who have spent years being underestimated understand exactly what was coming. "You." Her voice was light, amused. She said it the way people say things when they know everyone in the room is going to laugh. "The maintenance guy." A few heads turned. A few smiles began forming. "What's your name?" He held her gaze. "Andre. Andre." She repeated it the way people repeat a name when they're not really interested in it, when the name is just a prop. "Andre, how long have you been with Horizon?" 3 years. 3 years. Wonderful." She gestured toward the Valkyrie with the ease of someone who had already written the punchline. "Andre, I'm curious looking at this aircraft, this $30 million prototype. Do you have any thoughts on whether she'll fly?" Some laughter. Polite anticipatory. Waiting to see where this went. Andre said nothing. "Because I'll tell you what, Andre." Her voice lifted, performing now fully in the moment of it. "If you can get in that cockpit and fly this helicopter, and I mean actually fly it, not just start the engine, I will personally marry you right here in front of all these witnesses." The room erupted. It was the kind of laughter that fills a large space completely. Investors, engineers, staff, camera operators, everyone. Because it was funny. Because the joke was so obviously safe. Because the distance between the man in the maintenance uniform and the cockpit of a $30 million prototype was so enormous, so self-evident, that the suggestion was absurd on its face. Victoria was still smiling, her eyes bright with the success of it. And Andre Williams looked at the helicopter. Not at her. At the helicopter. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has not seen in a long time, but has never forgotten. The laughter continued around him. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply looked. And one person in that room, David Chow, who happened to be standing at the right angle, at the right moment, noticed something about the way Andre Williams looked at that aircraft and stopped laughing first. Before we go any further, let me tell you what nobody in that room knew. Nobody knew that Andre Williams had logged over 4,000 hours in rotary aircraft before he ever set foot in a maintenance uniform. Nobody knew that he had been trained by the United States Army, that he had flown in conditions that would have made every pilot in that room wake up in a cold sweat. At 3 in the morning, that he had been awarded commendations that were still sitting in a box in the closet of his apartment, because he had no reason to display them anymore. Nobody knew that the reason he walked away from all of it, the career, the status, the trajectory that would have taken him somewhere very different from where he was standing, was not failure. It was choice. It was a hospital room and a wife who was losing a battle she had fought longer than anyone expected her to fight, and a little girl who was 7 years old and did not understand yet what was happening, and a man who looked at his daughter's face and made a decision that had nothing to do with what he wanted and everything to do with what she needed. It was the morning he told his commanding officer he was putting in his separation papers. The officer had looked at him across the desk for a long time. "Williams, you understand what you're giving up?" "Yes, sir." "You're one of the best I've seen in 20 years. "Yes, sir." "And you're walking away to work a civilian job, be a stay-at-home father." "I'm going to raise my daughter, sir. She doesn't have anyone else." The officer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the bravest thing anyone's ever said to me in this office." Andre had carried that with him. Through every side entrance he'd walked through every condescending comment, every assumption, every moment of being looked through as though he wasn't there. He had carried it like ballast, not as pride, as foundation. But what he had also carried quietly, privately, in the part of himself that he did not show to anyone, was the knowledge. The deep physical cellular knowledge of flight. It does not leave you. Once your body has learned it, the feel of collective pitch under your left hand, the subtle counterintuitive dance of anti-torque pedals, the way a helicopter communicates through its controls in ways that language can barely describe it, does not leave. It waits, patient as gravity. He had not been in a cockpit in 3 years, but he had been in this hangar every day for 3 years. He had been near this machine for months. He had read every maintenance document, every service bulletin, every engineering spec that passed through the maintenance department, because he was the kind of person who read everything. He knew the Valkyrie. He knew her better than most of the people in this room. And he knew with the certainty that comes from thousands of hours of reading aircraft and trusting your body's understanding of them, exactly what Tom Reeves had been trying to say. Victoria was still waiting for someone to say something. The laughter had settled into that comfortable post-joke warmth, where the crowd feels good, and the performer feels powerful, and everything is proceeding exactly as intended. She spread her hands in a magnanimous gesture. "I think that's a no from Andre. Can't say I blame him." More laughter. "All right, let's—" The tail rotor. The room went quiet. Victoria turned back. Andre's voice had not been loud. It had not been angry. It had been the voice of someone stating a fact to a room that is not yet aware it is a fact. "What?" Victoria's smile thinned at the edges. "The tail rotor," Andre said again. "There's a vibration signature at full load that exceeds the safety threshold. Tom Reeves identified it. He was right. Your backup pilot did a pre-flight, and he saw it too, or he should have. If you put that aircraft into a full-power climb today, in front of all these people, you are gambling with lives." The room was completely silent. David Chow had stopped moving. The backup pilot standing near the aircraft was looking at the ground. Victoria Ashford looked at Andre Williams for a long moment. And what moved across her face in that moment, in that specific unguarded second, was something complicated. Something that was not purely contempt. Something that briefly resembled fear, and then was subsumed by something else. Something harder. "Are you finished?" "I haven't started." The words surprised even him when they came out. But they were true. He had been silent for 3 years. He had folded his report and put it in his truck and gone back to work. He had watched experienced people punished for telling the truth and told himself it was not his place, not his fight, not his problem. He looked around the room, at the investors with their tailored jackets and their polite uncertainty, at the engineers who knew what Tom Reeves knew and had said nothing, at the cameras that were rolling because someone had thought this would be good marketing, at his daughter's face in his mind, the way she looked at him when he picked her up from school, the way she had said 2 nights ago, "Dad, my teacher says it takes courage to tell the truth when no one wants to hear it." And he thought, yes, it does. "Your pilot refused to fly it," Andre said, his voice steady and clear in the silence of the hangar. "You fired him for that. You brought in someone else, and you're counting on the fact that the second man is more worried about his contract than his life. That's not a demonstration of safety. That's a demonstration of what happens when the person with power stops listening to the people with knowledge." Victoria's voice had dropped all the warmth out of it. "I think you need to return to your assigned work area. I think you know I'm right. I think—" She stopped. Something shifted in her expression. She looked at him, then at the investors, then back at him, and Andre could see her making a calculation. He had watched people make this calculation before. The calculation that said, "I can make this work for me. I can turn this into something that serves me." She picked up the microphone again, and she smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have a volunteer, our maintenance team." She gestured at Andre with something between contempt and performance. "Apparently has some thoughts about this aircraft. And since we believe in putting our money where our mouth is at Horizon." The smile sharpened into something bright and cold. "Andre, I will repeat my offer. If you can get in that cockpit, start that engine, and fly this helicopter, I will stand corrected. About everything." She paused. "And I meant what I said earlier, in front of all these witnesses." She laughed, and the crowd laughed with her because the joke had been refreshed and served again, and it was still safe, still obviously safe, still a guaranteed laugh. "Go ahead," she said. "Fly it." Andre looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at David Chow. David was not laughing. David was looking at Andre with an expression that Andre had not seen on a person's face in a very long time. Recognition. Andre nodded once, almost to himself. He walked to the Valkyrie. The laughter was still going when he opened the cockpit door. It had begun to diminish by the time he climbed in. It had died almost entirely by the time he began his pre-flight sequence. Because here was the thing about a man who truly knows what he is doing. He looks different. It is not something you can teach or perform. It is the difference between someone who has memorized how a thing should look and someone whose body simply knows what to do next. It is the difference between conscious action and something deeper, more automatic, more absolute. Andre Williams's hands moved through the pre-flight sequence, the way water moves through a channel it has traveled 10,000 times. Without hesitation, without reference to anything except knowledge so deeply embedded it had become instinct. Left hand to collective, right hand checking the cyclic. Eyes reading the instrument panel with the quick professional sweep of someone who has read 1,000 instrument panels and knows exactly which numbers matter and in what order. David Chow was watching. 3 of the engineers were watching. One of them said something very quietly to the man beside him. And gradually, not all at once, but progressively, like a light being turned up slowly in a dim room, the atmosphere in the hangar began to change. Victoria's smile had changed too. It had become something more careful, more uncertain. She was watching Andre from across the hangar with an expression that was no longer entirely in her control. The engine turned over. The rotors began to move. And the crowd that had been laughing 60 seconds earlier went absolutely, completely silent. He didn't show off. That is the first thing to understand. A man who has something to prove might have been theatrical, might have pushed the aircraft into maneuvers designed to impress, might have played to the crowd. Andre Williams did none of that. He brought the aircraft off the ground with the smooth, unhurried precision of someone for whom this was not a demonstration and not a performance. He climbed to an operational altitude. He held the aircraft in a stable hover, perfectly controlled, absolutely steady, and then he executed a series of maneuvers that were not dramatic in their appearance, but were to anyone who understood what they were seeing almost extraordinary in their technical precision. A coordinated pedal turn. A controlled sideward translation. A spot landing back to within 3 feet of his starting position. Simple, professional, textbook, and devastating. Because it was not the maneuvers that broke the room. It was the quality of the hands that performed them. In the crowd, one of the investors, a man who had spent 15 years as a commercial pilot before going into finance, had gone very still. He was watching the aircraft with the particular stillness of someone who has just realized something significant. His name was Robert Callahan, and he had not said anything since Andre climbed into the cockpit, and he would not say anything until Andre landed. And when he did speak, what he said was simply and quietly to the man beside him. Where did Horizon find this man? But before Andre landed, he did one more thing. He set the aircraft into an auto-rotation entry, a controlled engine-out simulation, the maneuver that separates pilots who understand helicopters from pilots who simply operate them, and he brought it down to a height that made 2 of the engineers involuntarily step backward, and then he recovered it clean and precise, and planted it back on the hangar floor, like a period at the end of a sentence. Done. He shut down the engine. He sat in the cockpit for a moment in the silence after the rotors stopped turning, and he thought about his daughter, about the way she would look when he told her about this day, about whether she would understand what it had cost him to get into that aircraft and what it had meant. He thought she probably would. She was her mother's daughter. In that way she understood things at a depth that consistently surprised him. He climbed out of the cockpit. The hangar was silent. Victoria Ashford was standing 12 feet away. Her face had changed in a way that no amount of professional training could have prevented. She looked for the first time since Andre had watched her walk through the crowd 17 minutes ago, or had it been longer? Time had moved strangely. She looked like a person rather than a performance. She looked like someone who had just been shown something she did not expect and could not immediately process. She looked at Andre Williams, at the maintenance uniform, at the toolbox, still sitting on the ground 20 feet away, where he had set it down, at the hands that had just controlled a $30 million aircraft, with more precision than anyone she had ever contracted to fly it. And she said nothing. For the first time possibly in a very long time. Victoria Ashford said nothing at all. Andre walked back to where his toolbox was sitting. He picked it up. And he waited because he was not done. There was still something that needed to be said. Not for him. Not for his reputation. Not for whatever the investors thought of him, or whatever the cameras had captured, or whatever story would get told about this day by the people who had been in the room for it. He needed to say it for Tom Reeves. He needed to say it for David Chow, who had filed the right reports and been ignored. He needed to say it for every person who had ever known the right thing and been silenced by someone with a title and a smile and a microphone. He set the toolbox back down. He turned back to the room, and he began to speak. His voice was the same as it had always been. Quiet, clear. The voice of a man who had learned that you do not need to be loud to be heard. You only need to be certain. My name is Andre Williams. I've worked maintenance here for 3 years. Before that, I flew helicopters for the United States Army for 11 years. I have 4,200 hours in rotary aircraft. I have flown in combat conditions and weather that grounded most pilots in situations that required decisions faster than most people can think. I left that career to raise my daughter after my wife passed away. He paused. Not for effect. Because the next words mattered, and he wanted them to land clean. The pilot you dismissed this morning, Tom Reeves, identified a legitimate safety defect in this aircraft's tail rotor assembly. He was correct. He refused to fly a machine he believed was unsafe in front of a crowd of people because he understood that his job is not to perform for investors. His job is to make sure that no one gets hurt. You fired him for that. He looked at Victoria. She held his gaze. "I'm not telling you this to embarrass you. I'm telling you this because the problem in that cockpit was fixable. The problem that caused Tom Reeves to walk out of this building is not fixable by a wrench. It gets fixed by leadership that listens. Leadership that understands that the most dangerous thing in aviation, the most dangerous thing in any organization, is not mechanical failure. It's a culture where the people with the most knowledge are afraid to tell the people with the most power what they need to hear." He reached down and picked up his toolbox. "The rotor issue is real. I'll write it up and have the documentation on David Chow's desk by end of day. That aircraft can fly. She's a remarkable piece of engineering, but she needs 2 more weeks minimum before she should be in the air with a full load in front of a crowd." He looked at the investors, at Robert Callahan, who was still watching him with that quiet, assessing stillness. "What you saw today is what happens when experience doesn't have a title. It doesn't disappear. It just waits." He turned and walked toward the side exit, the one without a keycard reader, the one that required you to knock and wait to be buzzed in. He pushed through it, and the morning air hit him, and he stood in the parking lot next to his 12-year-old truck and let out a breath that felt like it had been held for years. His phone buzzed. A text from his daughter. "How's your day, Dad?" He looked at the screen for a moment. Typed back, "Interesting. Tell you tonight." She sent back a heart emoji. He climbed into the truck. He sat there for a moment, not starting the engine, just sitting. And then, not out of victory, and not out of grief, and not out of anything he could have named, simply, Andre Williams put his face in his hands. And he cried. Because it was not about Victoria Ashford. It was not about proving something. It was about 11 years of flying, and a wife who had believed in him completely, and a daughter who looked at him every morning over breakfast, and trusted him absolutely, and 3 years of being invisible in a building where he knew more than he was permitted to say. And one morning when the cost of staying silent was finally higher than the cost of speaking. He wiped his face, started the truck. He had a daughter to pick up at 3:15. And nothing, not a $30 million helicopter, not a CEO with a microphone, not a room full of investors, not anything that had happened that morning was going to make him late for that. Inside the hangar nobody moved for a long time. David Chow was looking at the door Andre had walked out of. The backup pilot had sat down on a storage case near the aircraft. Robert Callahan was saying something quietly into his phone. And Victoria Ashford stood in the center of her hangar in front of her $30 million prototype, in front of the investors she had spent months cultivating, in front of the cameras she had arranged to capture her triumph. And she did not know yet what she was going to do. But she knew with the kind of certainty that arrives suddenly and cannot be argued away that something had fundamentally shifted. Not just in this room, in her. The text Andre sent his daughter that morning. Interesting. Tell you tonight was the most understated thing he had said in years. He drove home the long way, not because he was lost. Andre Williams had not been lost in this city in 3 years. He drove the long way because he needed the time, because something had cracked open inside him that morning, and he wasn't sure yet whether what was coming out of it was something good, or something that was going to cost him in ways he couldn't yet calculate. He passed the elementary school where Zoe went every day. The crossing guard, a retired postal worker named Earl, who wore the same tan jacket every morning, regardless of weather, was sitting in his folding chair outside the gate, eating a sandwich. Earl waved without looking up. Andre waved back. He passed the diner where he and Zoe ate breakfast every Sunday morning, the one with the cracked vinyl stools, and the bottomless coffee, and the cook who knew Zoe's order by heart, and always brought it out with a little triangle of orange on the side, even though Zoe had never once asked for it. He passed the community center where he'd coached Zoe's soccer team for 1 season, before his work schedule made it impossible to commit to the practices reliably. He'd felt guilty about that for months. Zoe had told him in the flat, certain voice she used when she wanted him to understand something was settled, that it was fine, that the new coach was fine, that she didn't need him on the sideline every Saturday to know he was her dad. She was 9 years old, and she regularly said things that made him feel like the student in the relationship. He pulled into his parking space at the apartment complex. The one with the yellow painted line that was fading but still visible. The one that said, Reserved Unit 14B in stenciled letters that someone had done slightly crooked. He sat with the engine running for another minute watching the way the light came through the windshield. Then he turned it off, went inside, and made coffee. And for the first time in a very long time, he sat down at his kitchen table in the middle of a workday with nowhere he needed to be. Because one way or another, he was fairly certain he no longer had a job. He'd been sitting there for 20 minutes when his phone rang. Not a text. A call. From a number he didn't recognize with a 6118 area code Boston. He almost didn't answer it. He answered it. Mr. Williams. The voice was careful professional, but underneath the professionalism, there was something else. The kind of barely contained energy that belongs to someone who has just witnessed something they are still processing. My name is Robert Callahan. We haven't formally met. I was in the hangar this morning. Andre was quiet for a moment. I know who you are. A brief pause on the other end. You do. You flew commercially for 15 years before you went into finance. You had your instrument rating at 19. You were at Delta for 8 years before you left to start Callahan Capital. I read the investor profiles when they circulated through the maintenance department last week. He paused. We get copied on everything for security reasons. Most people don't know that. Another pause longer this time. Then something that might have been a short, quiet laugh. Most people don't read them. I read everything. I'm beginning to understand that about you, Mr. Williams. A beat. I want to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Go ahead. When you got in that cockpit this morning, were you trying to prove something to Victoria Ashford? Or were you genuinely concerned about the aircraft? Andre considered the question the way he considered all questions that deserved actual consideration, without rushing, without performing thoughtfulness, but actually thinking. Both, he said finally, but in that order. The aircraft first. Always. Another pause, longer. The kind of pause that means the person on the other end is making a decision. I'd like to meet with you, Mr. Williams, not on behalf of Horizon Aviation, on my own behalf. I have some questions about what you saw in that rotor assembly and how long the issue has been documented internally. And I have some other questions that are less technical in nature. What kind of questions? The kind I should ask in person. Andre looked at his coffee cup. At the kitchen table, his wife had picked out at a second-hand store 8 years ago, the one with the scratch on the left side from when Zoe had dragged a toy truck across it at age 4, the scratch he had never sanded out because Zoe had been so distressed about it that he'd told her it was now his favorite part of the table, and that had become a thing between them. Dad's favorite scratch, and he was not going to sand it out now, regardless of what happened. All right, he said. He picked Zoe up at 3:15, same as always. She came through the school gate in a rush of backpack and energy stopped when she saw his face, and looked at him with the particular focus that 9-year-olds bring to reading their parents, the total unfiltered attention of someone who has not yet learned to look away from what they see. What happened? What makes you think something happened? Dad. He smiled. Get in the truck. She climbed in, dropped her backpack, buckled her seatbelt with the practiced speed of a child who has been doing it herself since she was 7, and turned to face him with the expression that meant she was waiting, and she had all the patience in the world. He told her. Not everything. Not the details about the rotor assembly or the technical specifications or the conversation with Robert Callahan, but the shape of it. The part that mattered. He told her about the woman with the microphone and the joke, and the room full of people laughing. He told her about Tom Reeves, who had told the truth and been walked out. He told her about getting in the helicopter. Zoe listened without interrupting, which was a thing she was still practicing. She was by nature a talker, loud and enthusiastic in the way her mother had been, and he loved that about her fiercely. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, she said she'd marry you. That's what you're focusing on. Dad, she said she'd marry you in front of everybody. It was a joke, Zoe. It was a mean joke. Yes. And you flew the helicopter. Yes. She processed this. He could see her processing it. Her brow furrowed the way it got when she was working through something. Were you scared? And that was the question, wasn't it? That was the question nobody else would think to ask, because the story, as it had unfolded, was a story about competence and courage, and the moment when the invisible man becomes visible. And in that kind of story, the hero is not supposed to be scared. Yes, he said. I was scared. Of crashing. He thought about how to say it accurately. Of what it meant. Getting back in. It had been a long time. Zoe looked at him with her mother's eyes dark and steady, and full of something that was not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent to it, something warmer and more useful than sympathy. Mom would have liked that you did it. He kept his eyes on the road. Yeah, he said quietly. I think she would have. That night, after Zoe was in bed, Andre sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and his coffee and the specific quality of nighttime silence that belongs to apartments where a child is sleeping. Not fully quiet, but hushed in a particular way, the way a held breath is hushed. He opened the browser. He typed a name into the search field. Victoria Ashford. Not because he was angry, not because he wanted ammunition, but because he had spent 3 years watching her company from the inside, from the maintenance level, and what he understood about her, from that vantage point, was necessarily incomplete. He had seen what she did. He had not seen fully who she was. What came up was what he expected, and more than he expected. The professional narrative was impeccable. MIT at 17. Multiple successful ventures. A profile in a major business magazine 3 years ago that used the word visionary 4 times in the first 3 paragraphs. A TED Talk about the future of aerospace that had 11 million views. A quote that got passed around in business circles. The most dangerous thing in any room is the person who hasn't decided yet how much they're willing to risk, which sounded to Andre's ear like the kind of thing that was profound and true, and also in the wrong hands, a justification for anything. But he kept reading. And in an interview from 7 years ago, a smaller publication, less curated, the kind of interview people give before they've fully mastered their own public narrative, he found something. The interviewer had asked her about failure, about the first time she'd faced a genuine setback rather than a temporary obstacle. She had talked about a project that collapsed, an early company before Horizon, before any of the success, something in drone technology that had failed badly enough to take most of her early investors' money with it. She had described the experience in terms that were careful and professional, but underneath the carefulness, if you read closely, and Andre read closely, there was something raw. She had said, "The hardest thing to learn was that I had surrounded myself with people who told me what I needed to hear to keep moving forward, and not one of them ever told me what I needed to hear to see clearly. I don't know if that was their failure or mine. I've spent a long time not being sure which it was." Andre read that paragraph twice. Then he closed the laptop. He thought about that sentence for a long time in the quiet of the kitchen. I don't know if that was their failure or mine. He thought about what it cost to build a public self so airtight that that sentence could only escape in a 7-year-old interview in a publication that most people would never read. He thought about what it meant to lead people from a place where you had decided somewhere foundational and early that the most dangerous thing you could do was let someone see that you didn't have the answer. He thought about what it was like to be that person, and he felt something that surprised him. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. But the beginning of understanding, which was he had learned where forgiveness generally started. He had not always been a patient man. That was something he had worked on, and work was the right word for it. It had not come naturally, and there were still days when the work was visible in his face if you knew what to look for. His first year in the Army, his training officer, a compact, unhurried man from rural Mississippi named Sergeant First Class Delroy Burkett, had told him something that had lodged in him so deeply, it had eventually stopped feeling like advice and started feeling like his own thought. They'd been sitting in a briefing room after a training exercise that had gone sideways in 3 different ways, and Andre had been tight with the specific anger of someone who is 22 years old and knows he was right and is trying to figure out how to say so without blowing up a room. Burkett had looked at him for a long moment, with the absolute stillness of a man who had been in many rooms with many young men who were right and tight with it, and he'd said, "Williams, you are going to be good at this. You might be very good at this. But right now, you think being good at something gives you the right to be mad when other people don't see it yet. And that's going to be a problem." "With respect, Sergeant, I know, you're right. I know you're right. That's not the question." Burkett had leaned forward slightly. "The question is what you do with being right. Because being right is only ever the beginning. The question is whether you can be right and still wait. Whether you can be right and still listen. Whether you can be right and still leave room for the people who aren't there yet." Andre had been quiet. "The cockpit doesn't care how frustrated you are," Burkett had continued. "The aircraft doesn't respond to your anger. It responds to your hands. Your hands respond to your mind. Your mind responds to your state. So if you want to be the pilot I think you can be, you have to figure out what to do with all that fire." He had paused. "Because the fire's good. The fire is what makes you exceptional. But fire that burns uncontrolled doesn't heat a room. It burns down a house." Andre had thought about Burkett more times than he could count since then. He thought about him now. He thought about the fire that had driven him out of the hangar that morning. Not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something with heat and urgency, and the sense that silence had finally reached its limit. He thought about whether that fire had burned something down, or whether for once it had lit something up. The next morning, he drove to the Horizon Aviation facility. He had not been terminated, at least not officially. No one had called. No one had sent an email. He had simply walked out of the hangar and driven home, and the administrative silence that followed was the silence of an institution that did not yet know how to categorize what had happened. He parked in the far corner of the lot, the cracked asphalt section, the one with the broken light. He walked to the side entrance. He knocked. He waited. Marcus buzzed him in. The facility had a different quality that morning. He felt it before he could have explained it, a difference in the way people moved or didn't move, or in the particular way that a group of people who have shared a significant experience behave when the person at the center of that experience walks back into the room. Marcus was standing near the time clock when Andre came in. Marcus was a large man, broad-shouldered, who had been in maintenance for 20 years and who ran his shift with the particular combination of strictness and loyalty that made people trust him even when they didn't like what he was saying. He looked at Andre for a moment. "You got a message." He handed over a folded note. "From Cheo's office. They want you up there at 9. Andre took the note, read it, folded it back. "Okay, Andre." Marcus hesitated. He was not by nature a man who hesitated. "What you did yesterday, a lot of people saw it. A lot of people had things to say about it." He paused again. Most of what they said was, "Marcus, yeah. I need to drop my documentation off with David before 9. Can you cover Bay 7 for me for an hour?" Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Yeah, I got it." David Cheo's office was on the 3rd floor. Andre had been on the 3rd floor twice in 3 years, both times, to deliver signed maintenance logs to a filing room at the end of the hall. He had never been in David's office. He had seen David regularly in the hangar, and they had had professional exchanges, calm, technical, respectful, but the distance between their positions in the organizational hierarchy was wide enough that those exchanges had always happened on the ground floor in David's territory, where David came to him. The office was what he expected, and slightly more cluttered than he expected. Whiteboards covered in diagrams and calculations. A scale model of the Valkyrie on a shelf. Stacks of engineering reports in 3 piles on the desk that had clearly been organized at some point and had since been reorganized by urgency. David was already there when Andre knocked. He looked up. Something moved across his face that was not quite guilt and not quite relief, but something that shared characteristics with both. "Sit down." Andre sat. David looked at the documentation. Andre had brought the written technical assessment of the tail rotor issue, the specific maintenance log entries he'd flagged over the past 4 months, The service bulletin he'd cross-referenced from a different aircraft variant with a similar rotor design. He read through it without speaking. When he finished, he set it down carefully. "You've known about this for 4 months. I flagged it informally in January. I was told it was outside my role." David was quiet. "I should have—" He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "The report you submitted it to Marcus. In writing. He read it and told me to let the engineers handle it. We never received it." The words sat between them. "No," Andre said. "You didn't." David put his hands flat on the desk and looked at them. It was the gesture of a man who is accounting for something. Doing the specific arithmetic of failure, how it accumulates, whose responsibility each increment represents, what it means, that the sum is what it is. "I knew about the vibration issue," David said finally. "My team identified it 6 weeks ago. I escalated it. I was told the timeline was fixed, that we would manage the risk, that the demonstration was not optional." "I know." David looked up. "You know, I've been in that building for 3 years, David. I hear things." A pause. "Why didn't you say something sooner yesterday before it got to that point?" "I tried." The words were simple, and they landed simply. "I tried 3 months ago in writing. I tried yesterday morning when I walked up to that perimeter and listened to you and Tom Reeves. I tried when I spoke up in front of the room, and she told me to go back to my work area." He paused. "Then she invited me to fly the helicopter, so I flew the helicopter." David looked at him for a long time. "I owe Tom Reeves a phone call," David said finally, quietly, less to Andre than to the accounting he was doing in his own chest. "You do," Andre agreed. Another silence, but a different kind. The kind that exists between two people who have arrived at the same place from different directions and are taking a moment to acknowledge that they are standing in the same spot. "Victoria wants to meet with you," David said. "That's what the 9 o'clock is. She called me at 6:30 this morning. She's been in the building since 7. Andre absorbed this. "What's her state of mind?" David considered the question carefully. "Controlled. But underneath that—" He shook his head slightly. "She doesn't show things, Andre. She's built her whole career on not showing things. But she called me at 6:30 in the morning, which means she didn't sleep, which means last night was—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The conference room on the 4th floor had a view of the flight line. Andre arrived at 8:57. He was early. He was always early. It was a habit from the army so deep it had become part of his body's sense of time, and Victoria Ashford was already there. She was sitting at the head of the table. She had a coffee in front of her that looked like it had been there long enough to be cold. She was wearing a different jacket than yesterday, dark navy, and her hair was down in a way it hadn't been for the demonstration, and these were small things, incidental things, but they told him she had dressed this morning without the specific armor she normally wore to public events. She looked at him when he came in. He sat down across from her. Not at the far end of the table. Directly across. Close enough that this was a conversation and not a performance. She said nothing for a moment. He waited. "I had a whole speech prepared," she said. "I've been in this building since 7 o'clock working on it." The right words, the right framing, the right way to address what happened yesterday in a way that was— She stopped. Her jaw moved briefly. "Professionally appropriate." He said nothing. "I'm going to throw it out," she said, "because I think another stop." The pause of someone who has spent so long finding the right words for every occasion that finding no words feels like a physical difficulty. "I think you've seen enough of people in this building saying the right thing instead of the true thing." She picked up the coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. "I was wrong." The words were flat and clean. No cushioning. No professional softening. "I was wrong about Tom Reeves. I was wrong about the aircraft. I was wrong about—" She looked at him directly. "You. The way I spoke to you in front of those people. The way I used you as a prop for a joke." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that steadiness was working to contain. "That was wrong. Not wrong in the way that matters. The way that doesn't get fixed by a formal apology." No, Andre said. It doesn't. She held his gaze. Why did you come back this morning? I had a documentation report to file. That's not the only reason. He considered. No. Then why? He put his hands on the table in front of him. Large hands, the hands of someone who had spent years working with them both in the air and on the ground. Because there are 30 people in this building who watched you fire Tom Reeves for telling the truth. And they went home last night and they're back here this morning and they're watching to see what happens next. Not to me. They're watching to see if anything changes. If the culture of this place is capable of changing. He paused. I came back because I think it might be. And I didn't want to find out the answer from a distance. Victoria was quiet for a long time, outside the window. The flight line was quiet in the early morning. The Valkyrie sat in the hangar below the doors, closed the rotor blades still. I read something last night, she said finally, carefully. About how organizations develop blind spots. How the most dangerous blind spots are the ones at the top, because the higher you are, the more people around you are invested in not pointing them out. She stopped. I've read it before. I've cited it. I've given talks about exactly that phenomenon. Her voice had something in it now that was close to disbelief, directed at herself. And it's easier to see in other people, Andre said. She looked at him. It always is, he said. That's not an excuse, it's just what it is. She was quiet again. Then, I want to bring Tom Reeves back. Full reinstatement, full compensation for yesterday. David is making the call this morning. She paused. I want your technical documentation filed properly and reviewed by the full engineering team by end of week. The Valkyrie doesn't fly again until the rotor issue is resolved, genuinely resolved, not managed. Another pause. And I want to talk to you about your role here. Not the role you have. The role you should have. Andre looked at her steadily. I have a condition, he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not resistance. Attentiveness. My daughter, he said. Whatever the role is, whatever the hours are, whatever the travel or the demands, my daughter is 9 years old and she is my first priority. That doesn't change. It doesn't flex around a deadline. It doesn't get managed or scheduled around. She comes first. Victoria looked at him, and something happened in her face that was not the controlled professional composure she had walked into the room wearing. Something quieter and more human than that. My father missed every school play I was ever in, she said, very quietly. Everyone. There was always something that mattered more. She stopped. I've built 3 companies in the time since. I've never once gone to a school play. She picked up her coffee, drank from it even though it was cold. Your daughter comes first, she said. That's not a condition, that's a baseline. Whatever we build from here, that's the foundation. Andre looked at her for a long moment, and Sergeant First Class Delroy Burkett's voice came back to him clear across years and distance. The question is whether you can be right and still wait. Whether you can be right and still leave room for the people who aren't there yet. All right, Andre said. Outside the window. The morning light had reached the flight line. The Valkyrie sat waiting patient as a promise ready for the moment when the people responsible for her would finally be ready for each other. The meeting with Victoria lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. Andre knew the exact duration because when he walked back out of the conference room and into the hallway, he looked at his watch, out of habit, the same watch he'd worn in the army, a plain field watch with a black face and a worn canvas strap that Zoe had twice offered to replace with something nicer, and that he had twice declined, and it read 11:08, which meant he needed to recalculate his afternoon around a conversation that had gone longer than he expected, and left him carrying more than he had walked in with. He took the elevator back down to the maintenance level. He walked through this corridor that ran alongside Bay 7, past the smell of hydraulic fluid and metal, and the particular industrial warmth of machinery that has been running since early morning, and he felt the floor under his feet the way he always did. Solid, familiar, his territory. In a way the 4th floor conference room was not and might never be, regardless of whatever title ended up on whatever paperwork got generated from this morning's conversation. Marcus was waiting near the time clock again. Not obviously waiting. Marcus never waited obviously. He was doing something with a clipboard and a pen, and he looked up when Andre came through with the particular casualness of a man who has absolutely been standing there waiting for the last 20 minutes. How'd it go? Andre took his toolbox from his locker, checked the contents out of habit the same way he checked aircraft instruments out of habit. Not because he expected anything to be missing, but because the act of checking was itself the point. She's bringing Tom Reeves back. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Full reinstatement. Full pay for yesterday. Marcus absorbed this. He turned it over. The way a man turns over something he wants to believe, but has been burned enough times to be careful about believing. And the aircraft. Grounded until the rotor issue is resolved. Real resolution, not a patch. Marcus set the clipboard down on the workbench beside him. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the floor for a moment, in the way that men look at the floor when they are feeling something they are not going to say directly. 20 years I've been in maintenance, he said. 20 years. I have filed reports that went nowhere. I have flagged issues that got managed around. I have watched experienced people get thanked for their input and then walked right back to doing exactly what they were told. He paused. I told you in January that the rotor report was outside your role. You did. I was wrong. Andre looked at him. I knew you were right, Marcus said. I knew it when I read it. I also knew that the person I sent it up to wasn't going to want to hear it, and I made a calculation about what was mine to fight and what wasn't. He picked the clipboard back up not because he needed it, but because his hands wanted something to do. That calculation had consequences. Yes, Andre said. It did. I'm not looking for you to tell me it's fine. I know. Marcus nodded once sharply. The nod of a man who has said what he needed to say and does not need it validated. Bay 7's done. I covered it clean. He turned back to his work. You've got a message from someone named Callahan. Left a number. Said you'd know who he was. Tom Reeves answered on the second ring. Andre had gotten his number from David Chow's assistant, a young woman named Patricia, who had looked at Andre when he walked into the outer office with the kind of barely contained attention that told him his presence in the building had become something that people were noticing and processing and not entirely sure what to do with yet. Tom picked up, and there was background noise on his end. What sounded like a kitchen morning. Sounds the low murmur of a television somewhere. Williams. Tom's voice was measured. Careful. The voice of a man who had been fired less than 24 hours ago and was not yet sure of the shape of what came next. I heard you flew her. I flew her. A pause. How'd she handle? Better than she should given the rotor condition. She's a good aircraft. She is. A longer pause. I heard about what you said. What you said before you walked out of there. Andre waited. You didn't have to do that, Tom said. The part about me specifically. You didn't have to put that in front of the room. I know. But you did. You were right, Andre said. You did the right thing, and you paid for it in front of a room full of people. That needed to be said in front of the same room. Tom was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, something in his voice had shifted. Not softer exactly, more direct. 22 years, Williams. I have never refused a flight. Not once. And I stood there yesterday and I knew what would happen. I knew she would fire me. I knew I would walk out of that building and everyone in that room would watch me go and not one person would say a word. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that cost something. And I did it anyway because I cannot put an aircraft in the air in front of civilians when I know the aircraft is not ready. I cannot do that. A pause. But it costs something. Doing the right thing when everyone's watching you do it and no one's backing you up, it costs something that doesn't just go away overnight. No, Andre said. It doesn't. David called this morning. Reinstatement. I know. I'm going to take it, Tom said. But I want you to know it's not because of the money. I've got savings. I could find other work. A pause. I'm going to take it because of what you said. About the culture. About what happens when the people with knowledge stop talking to the people with power. His voice was quieter now, I want to be in the room for whatever comes next. I don't want to watch it from outside. Good, Andre said. I think we're going to need everyone who was paying attention yesterday. After he hung up, he sat in his truck in the parking lot for 3 minutes. He was not a man who cried easily. He had cried twice in the 3 years since his wife died, once at the funeral, and once 6 months later in the shower on a Tuesday morning for reasons he couldn't have named and didn't try to. Grief worked on its own schedule and didn't negotiate. He was not crying now, but there was something in his chest that was pressing against his ribs in a way that required him to sit still for a moment before he was ready to move. Robert Callahan flew in from Boston that afternoon. Andre met him at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the facility neutral ground Callahan had suggested, and Andre had agreed, because neutral ground was a choice that said something in itself, said, I am not coming to you with institutional authority, said this is a conversation between people rather than a meeting between positions. Callahan was shorter in person than he'd appeared in the hangar. Compact and precise, with the posture of someone who had spent years in cockpits and carried the habit of taking up the exact right amount of space, no more no less. I was in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, and he looked at Andre across the small table with the direct appraising attention of someone who was accustomed to evaluating situations quickly and accurately. He had 2 files in front of him. He did not open them immediately. I've been an aviation investor for 11 years, he said. Before that, as you apparently already know, 15 years commercial. Before that, 2 years military. Cargo, not rotary. He paused. I know what a trained pilot looks like in a cockpit. I know the difference between someone performing competence and someone exercising it. He looked at Andre steadily. What I watched yesterday was not a maintenance worker getting lucky with $30 million of machinery. No. Army. 11 years. Rotary the whole time. From the beginning. Black Hawks primarily. Some Chinook time toward the end. 2 combat deployments, 1 training tour. Callahan nodded slowly, the nod of a man who is confirming what he already suspected. Why maintenance? And here it was. The question that followed him everywhere he went, that lived in the pauses after people learned the basic outline of his life, the before and the after. The decorated pilot and the maintenance worker. The gap between them that people always wanted, explained. Because gaps like that made people uncomfortable, because they implied that life did not always make the kind of sense that made everyone feel better about the choices they had made. My wife got sick, Andre said. Stage 4 breast cancer. Diagnosed 18 months after Zoe was born. She fought it for 6 years. During those 6 years, I restructured everything around her treatment schedule, and making sure Zoe had at least one parent who was consistently present. He paused. When my wife died, Zoe was 7. I was her only parent. I put in my separation papers 3 months later. Callahan was quiet. The military was, I loved it. I was good at it. But it's not a life you can build around a 7-year-old who has just lost her mother. The hours, the deployments, the uncertainty, she needed something I could only give her if I was home. Every night. Predictable. Present. He picked up his coffee. Maintenance work has predictable hours. I can pick my daughter up from school every day at 3:15. That was the decision. Callahan looked at him for a long moment. My son is 31 years old, he said finally. He runs a company in Seattle. He's good at it, smart, driven. A pause. I was not home for most of what mattered when he was growing up. I told myself the work was for him, for the family, for the future. He stopped. He's told me as an adult, carefully, without anger, because he's more generous than I deserve, that what he needed was not the future I was building. He needed the present I was absent from. He looked down at the table. I'm telling you that because you should know that what you chose, I understand the cost of the alternative in a way that took me 30 years to understand. Andre said nothing. The coffee shop was the kind of place that was full in the morning and quiet in the mid-afternoon, a scattering of people on laptops, a barista restocking the pastry case, the low ambient sound of a space that was not trying to be anything except what it was. Callahan opened one of the files. I represent a consortium of investors in Horizon. Not the majority of the board, but a significant enough position that my voice carries weight when I choose to use it. He turned a page. What happened yesterday has created a situation that needs to be addressed carefully. Victoria Ashford is a brilliant operator. She has also, as of approximately 10:17 yesterday morning, demonstrated publicly that the company has a safety culture problem significant enough to potentially affect FAA certification conversations, future insurance underwriting, and depending on how the footage that was taken in that hangar finds its way into the world public perception. "I'm not interested in taking down Horizon Aviation," Andre said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know." Callahan looked at him. "I'm not interested in taking down Horizon Aviation," Andre said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know." Callahan looked at him. "That's part of why I'm here. Someone who wanted to take down the company would have handled yesterday differently. You flagged a safety issue, demonstrated competence, made your point, and walked out. You didn't go to the press. You didn't call a lawyer. You came back to work this morning and filed proper documentation through the right channels." He paused. "That tells me something about what you're after." "What do you think I'm after?" "I think you want the aircraft to be safe," Callahan said. "I think you want the people who did the right thing yesterday, Reeves Chow, to not be punished for it. And I think—" He paused, and the pause had the quality of someone choosing words with particular care. "I think you might want the opportunity to do work that matches what you're actually capable of, even if you didn't walk in here this morning knowing that's what you wanted." Andre looked at him. "What are you proposing?" Callahan closed the file. "I'm proposing that the investor group formally recommend to the board that Horizon establish a safety advisory position, someone with genuine operational experience in rotary systems, who reports directly to the executive level and has the authority to flag concerns that cannot be overridden below that level." He paused. "Someone whose role exists specifically to prevent the kind of situation that nearly happened yesterday from happening again. Not a committee, a person, with real authority and a real voice." Andre was quiet for a moment. "And you're talking about me for that role?" "I'm talking about you for that role. Victoria and I have already discussed something similar." Callahan nodded. "I know. She called me at 7 this morning, which is why I flew down this afternoon instead of next week." A slight pause. "She could have handled this a dozen different ways, Andre. She could have minimized. She could have managed the narrative. She could have made an internal correction quietly and let the public moment fade." He looked at him directly. "She called the people whose opinion she needed to be honest with and told them she was wrong. At 7 in the morning, after presumably not sleeping." He paused again. "I've known Victoria for 6 years. I have never heard her say those words before." Andre absorbed this. "My condition is my daughter," he said. "She comes first. Whatever the role is, whatever it requires." Victoria mentioned that. And Callahan said, "That's not a complication. That's a character reference." He picked Zoe up at 3:15, same as always. She was waiting at the gate with 2 of her friends deep in a conversation that stopped when she saw his truck and resumed apparently in her head, because she climbed in with the slightly distracted energy of a person whose mind is still in the previous conversation. "Dad, can I ask you something serious?" "Always. Madison says that when you're good at something and someone tries to make you feel bad about it, the best thing to do is just show them. But Priya says that showing them is just letting them control you because you're only doing it because of them." She buckled her seatbelt. "Who's right?" He pulled out of the school lot and thought about this genuinely, because Zoe's questions deserved genuine thought, and she always knew the difference. "What do you think?" "I think they're both partly right. But I think there's a third option that's better than both." "What's the third option?" "You show them, but not for them. You show them because the thing matters. Because the thing that needs doing regardless of whether someone was mean about it." She looked at him with her mother's eyes steady and certain. "Like it shouldn't be about proving something to a person. It should be about doing the thing because it's right." He drove for a moment in silence. "That's very good," he said. "I know." She turned to look out the window. "I figured it out this morning when I was thinking about yesterday." He glanced at her. "I thought about what you did," she said. "You didn't fly the helicopter to prove something to that lady. You flew it because the plane wasn't safe and people might get hurt. The proving part just happened at the same time." She paused. "Right." He kept his eyes on the road. "Right," he said quietly. "That's exactly right." 3 days after the demonstration, the footage appeared online. Not the full 2 hours. A 90-second clip taken on someone's phone that showed Victoria's joke and Andre's silence, and then cut together with what appeared to be shaky real-time footage the moment the Valkyrie left the ground. 90 seconds. No context. No explanation. By the time Andre saw it that evening, it had 400,000 views. He watched it twice, which was enough. He looked like what he was in the footage, a man in a maintenance uniform standing very still, while a room laughed at him, and then a man whose hands moved through a pre-flight sequence with the ease of someone who has done it thousands of times. The quality of the footage was poor enough that you couldn't hear the individual words, only the texture of the exchange, the laughter of the crowd, the silence of the man at the center of it, the subsequent silence of the crowd when the aircraft lifted. He set his phone face down on the kitchen table. Zoe was in her room doing homework. He could hear her a low occasional muttering that meant she was working through a math problem she disagreed with. He thought about calling David, about calling Victoria, about getting ahead of whatever was coming. He picked up the phone instead and called Marcus. "I know," Marcus said when he answered. "I've been watching the numbers." "What do we do?" Marcus's voice had something in it that was close to warmth. "Since when is it we?" "Since you covered Bay 7 for me and told me you were wrong about January." A pause. "Fair enough." He could hear Marcus thinking. "You don't do anything. You let the clip be what it is. You don't explain it. You don't contextualize it. You don't go on social media and make a statement. The clip tells the truth well enough on its own." A pause. "But Victoria's going to need to say something. And what she says is going to matter more than the clip." "I know." "Does she know?" Andre thought about the woman who had called Robert Callahan at 7 in the morning to say she was wrong. "Yes," he said. "She knows." The numbers were at 800,000 by the time he went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while, listening to the apartment settle around him. The particular night sounds of a building that housed 80 families. The low frequency of other people's lives going on in adjacent rooms. The occasional sound of Zoe turning over in her sleep, 3 feet on the other side of the wall between their rooms. He thought about his wife. Her name had been Diana. She had been a high school English teacher who had believed with a fervency that he had occasionally found both exhausting and essential, that stories were the most important technology human beings had ever developed. More important than aircraft. More important than computers. More important than anything that could be engineered or built or flown. A story she had told him once, lying in the hospital bed during one of the bad weeks with Zoe asleep in the chair in the corner and the monitors doing their quiet work beside her, can go anywhere. That's the thing. It doesn't need fuel. It doesn't need permission. You put it in the world, and it goes where it needs to go, and it finds the people who need it. He had held her hand and not said anything, because there was nothing to say. Because she was right in the way that she was always right about things like this. He wondered, lying in the dark, if she would have believed him if he'd told her that one day a 90-second phone video of her husband standing in a hangar would be watched by 1 million people. He thought she probably would have. She had always believed in the places stories could travel. He arrived at the facility at 6 a.m. the next morning. Victoria was already there. This was becoming a pattern he was starting to recognize. She arrived early when the day ahead required something of her that she was not entirely sure she had, and the early arrival was the way she gathered herself. She was in the conference room with David and Tom Reeves, who had come back the previous morning with the particular quiet dignity of a man who had been wronged publicly and was now returning publicly, not with triumph, not with grievance, but with the simple professional intention of doing his job. Tom Reeves was that kind of person. Andre had known it the moment he saw him standing with his arms crossed in the hangar, and the past 48 hours had done nothing to revise that assessment. Andre came in and sat down. Victoria looked at him. "You've seen the clip." "Last night." "It's at 2 million this morning." "I know." She had a legal pad in front of her with notes in small, precise handwriting. She turned it over so the notes were face down. I want to respond publicly. I've drafted something. I've revised it 4 times since 3 this morning. She paused. David thinks I should say less. Tom thinks I should say more. I'd like to know what you think. Andre looked at her. What does the 4 a.m. version say? She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned the pad back over and found the 4th draft and read it. It was careful and clear. It acknowledged the incident without minimizing it. It took specific responsibility, not organizational responsibility, not a passive institutional apology, but first-person named responsibility. It committed to Tom's reinstatement. It committed to the safety review. It mentioned Andre by name. It was by any professional standard a very good statement. When she finished reading, he was quiet for a moment. The last paragraph, he said. The one that ends with the commitments. What about it? Read me just that paragraph again. She found it, read it. He listened. Everything in that paragraph is true, he said when she finished. Yes. You should also say why it's true, not the policy reasons, the real reason. She looked at him. You said something to me 2 days ago, he said, about your father missing every school play, about never going to one yourself. He paused. You don't have to say that in public, that's yours. But the thing underneath it, the understanding that there are people in your organization whose whole lives are structured around something you've never had to factor into your decisions. That understanding is what makes the commitments mean something. And if you can find a way to put that in the statement without making it about you. She was looking at the pad. She picked up the pen. She wrote for 2 minutes without stopping. Then she put the pen down and read what she'd written out loud. It was 13 sentences. When she finished, the room was quiet. Tom Reeves, who had been a commercial pilot for 22 years, and who was not a man given to visible emotion, was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has heard something that surprised him. David said, "That's it. That's the statement." Victoria looked at Andre. He nodded once. She picked up her phone. He walked down to the maintenance level afterward and stood in Bay 7 for a few minutes alone, running his hands over the frame of the older aircraft he was supposed to have checked 3 days ago before the morning went sideways. He checked it now. Methodically. Completely. The way he always checked things, not because he expected to find something, but because the act of checking was itself a form of respect for the machine and the people who would fly it. He found a loose fitting in the fuel line connection on the port side. A minor thing, the kind of thing that might have gone unnoticed through several more inspections if he hadn't been the one doing this particular inspection at this particular time. He tagged it, logged it, started the repair. He was an hour into it when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. He read it. Then he read it again. It was from a woman in Ohio. She said she had watched the clip that morning and that her father had been a Vietnam veteran who had worked as a school janitor for 30 years after he came home, and that she had shown the clip to her father's photograph on the wall of her kitchen because her father had been gone for 6 years and she thought he would have liked it, and she was sorry if that was strange, but she just needed to say it to someone. Andre stood with his phone in his hand and the tagged fitting in front of him and the ordinary sounds of the maintenance bay around him. He typed back, "It's not strange at all. Thank your father for his service. I think he and I would have understood each other." He put the phone back in his pocket. He finished the repair. He logged it. He moved to the next item on his checklist. Because the aircraft needed to be safe. Because it always came back to that. Because in the end, that was the thing that had put him in the cockpit. And that was the thing that kept him here in Bay 7 with his hands on a fuel line fitting. And that was the thing that no title change or viral clip or investor conversation could alter. The aircraft needed to be safe. The people who flew it needed to come home. That was the job. It had always been the job. And Andre Williams, 4,200 hours, 11 years, 1 daughter, 1 wife who had believed in the places stories could travel, had never once done anything that was not at its foundation. Exactly that. The statement went out at 9:17 on a Thursday morning. Victoria posted it herself on her own personal account, not the company's. That was the first thing people noticed. Not a PR-managed corporate release pushed through Horizon's communications team. Not a carefully timed media statement distributed to selected outlets. Her own account with her name on it, in the middle of a regular Thursday morning when the internet was already doing what it did with the clip that had now crossed 4 million views. Andre was in Bay 7 when his phone started going in a way it had never gone before in his life. Not his personal contacts. He had 61 contacts in his phone, and most of them were people he saw regularly. Zoe's school. Marcus, a few people from his army years. He still spoke with a couple times a year, his landlord, the mechanic who serviced his truck. The notifications were coming from the clip itself, which someone had tagged him in without his knowledge, and from Victoria's statement, which mentioned his name, and from a world he had not been inside of in a very long time, suddenly becoming aware that he existed. He turned the phone face down on the workbench. He finished the service check he was doing. He turned it back over. 11,000 notifications in 40 minutes. He stood there holding the phone for a moment in the fluorescent light of the maintenance bay, with the smell of hydraulic fluid and the sound of an air compressor cycling on somewhere in the adjacent bay. And he understood with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 3 years being invisible that the invisible period was over. Not gradually, not on a schedule he controlled. Over. He called Zoe's school, got the front desk, asked them to make sure no one released his daughter to anyone but him at 3:15, that there might be some media attention in the coming days, that he wanted to make sure she was protected from it until he could talk to her. The woman on the other end of the phone, Mrs. Patterson, who had been managing the front desk for 11 years and who had a specific calm competence for exactly this kind of call, said, "I know who you are, Mr. Williams. Half the teachers have been watching the video this morning. We'll take care of her." He thanked her and hung up. He went upstairs to the 4th floor. Victoria was on a call when he knocked. She held up one finger through the glass door of her office, finished the call in 45 seconds, and waved him in. "How are you doing?" she asked. And she meant it. It was not a professional courtesy. It was a genuine question, with the weight of someone who understood that she had done something by putting his name in a public statement without asking him first. "I should have been consulted before you mentioned me by name." She held his gaze. "You're right. I should have called you last night. I decided at 4 in the morning, and I sent it at 9, and I didn't think clearly about what it would mean for you specifically." She paused. "I'm sorry." He sat down. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need my daughter's pickup at 3:15 to be normal," he said. "I need her school to be protected. I need—" He stopped, found the right words. "I need whatever is coming to not land on her before I've had the chance to explain it to her in a way she can handle." What has she been told? The truth. What happened in the shape she can understand at 9 years old. Not the internet version. Not the... He gestured toward her desk, toward the phone, toward the world outside her window. She knows her dad flew a helicopter and said some things that needed saying. She doesn't know that 2 million people watched 60 seconds of it. Victoria was already reaching for her phone. "I'm going to have our communications team reach out to the school directly, not to manage the story, just to offer a liaison contact in case media shows up on the property. Is that acceptable?" "Yes. Thank you." She made the call in front of him brief and direct, the kind of call that got things done because the person making it had the authority and the clarity to say exactly what was needed and nothing more. When she hung up, she looked at him. "The board wants a call this afternoon. Robert Callahan is already on record with his position. The other members are varied." She paused. "Some of them are celebrating. They think the clip is good for the brand." "Is that what they said?" One of them used the phrase authenticity marketing. Her voice was flat. "I told him that Andre Williams was not a marketing asset, and that if anyone on this board referred to him in those terms again, I would consider it a boardroom culture issue that I would address accordingly." She paused. He got quiet. Andre looked at her. "Others are concerned," she continued, "about liability, about the safety disclosure that's now implicitly public, about whether the FAA will take a closer look." She set her phone down. "The liability concern is real, and we're handling it through counsel. The FAA question is one I welcome, because it will result in a proper certification review which is what should have happened 6 months ago. She paused. And the board members who are celebrating, I need them to understand what this actually means before they turn it into a narrative that isn't true. What does it actually mean? She was quiet for a moment. It means I failed at something fundamental, she said. And a person I had no reason to trust gave me the opportunity to do something about it before the failure became catastrophic. That's what it means. She picked up her pen, put it down again. I don't want this company's story to be about a viral moment. I want it to be about what we did next, what we actually changed, whether the rotor gets fixed properly, whether Tom Reeves is genuinely back and genuinely heard, whether... She looked at him directly. Whether you stay. He looked back at her. I haven't decided. I know. The condition hasn't changed. I know that too. He stood up. I'll be in Bay 7. The board call whatever you need from me to support the safety case, the documentation, the technical specifics. I'll make myself available. That's within my role as a maintenance technician, and it doesn't require any new title or any decision about what comes next. She nodded. He walked out. The board call was at 2 o'clock. Andre was not on it. He was in Bay 7, where he had been most of the day, working through the maintenance backlog, with a focus that was part genuine necessity and part the deep human need to do something with his hands when his mind was carrying too much. Marcus came and went without saying much, which was Marcus's way of saying quite a lot. Tom Reeves stopped by at 1:30. He was back in his flight suit, which meant he'd been doing aircraft checks, which meant someone had cleared him to return to active flight status, which meant more had happened in the past 18 hours than Andre had been fully tracking. You eat today? Tom asked. Coffee. That's not eating. I know. Tom sat down on the storage case across from Andre's workbench, the same one the backup pilot had sat on 2 days ago. He had a paper bag from the deli around the corner. He set it between them. Turkey on wheat, he said. Patricia in David's office told me you don't eat red meat. Andre looked at the bag. You got flight status back. This morning, David expedited it. Tom unwrapped his own sandwich. I did a full pre-flight on the Valkyrie this morning. Spent 2 hours on her. The rotor issue is documented now, really documented with your write-up and the team's technical assessment on record. The repair timeline is 3 weeks minimum. He took a bite. She's a good aircraft. When she's right, she's going to be something. Yes. How are you doing with all of it? Andre picked up the sandwich, looked at it. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I keep waiting to feel one clear thing about it, and instead I feel about 9 things that don't entirely agree with each other. That sounds about right. Tom chewed thoughtfully. You know what I keep thinking about that moment in the hangar when you started the pre-flight? I was standing there watching you, and about 30 seconds in, I just thought, who is this man? Not skeptically, genuinely. Because the hands where the hands don't lie. You know that as well as I do. You can fake a lot of things in aviation. You cannot fake what the hands do when they've done something 10,000 times. Andre was quiet. I looked you up, Tom said. After yesterday. Army service records not public, but your commendations are on record. Combat Action Badge. Air Medal with V device for valor. 2 deployments. He paused. You saved a crew in a mountain valley in Afghanistan, in conditions that grounded every other aircraft on the base. That's on record. The unit citation is, the specifics aren't. Tom looked at him. You walked away from that to be a school pickup. I walked away from that to be a father. Same thing. Not exactly. Tom thought about this. No, you're right. Not exactly. He balled up his sandwich wrapper. My kids are grown, 33 and 30. I was present for their childhood in the way a man is present when he's home, but not fully there, because his head is always partly in the sky. He said it without self-pity, just the flat accounting of someone who has looked at something honestly. I don't get to go back and fix that, but I see what you did, and I understand what it cost, and I just want you to know that from where I sit, it's the most... He stopped, cleared his throat. It took more guts than the mountain valley. Andre looked at the workbench. Don't tell anyone I said that, Tom said, standing. I have a reputation for being a hard ass. Noted. Tom picked up his paper bag. Board call at 2. Victoria's going to need the safety documentation bulletproofed. I've already sent her my assessment. You should send yours directly to the board package, not just through David. He paused at the entrance to the bay. You're not maintenance anymore, Andre. You might not have the title yet, but you're not maintenance anymore. Start acting like it. He walked out. Andre sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and sent his full technical documentation directly to Victoria's assistant with a note that it was for the board package. Zoe already knew about the video when he picked her up at 3:15. He saw it in her the moment she came through the gate. A different quality of attention than usual. Not distracted or school-tired, but focused and watchful. The face of a child who has been sitting with information all day and waiting for the right moment to talk about it. She climbed in, buckled her seatbelt, turned to face him. Madison showed me the clip at lunch. He pulled out of the lot. I know. There's another one now, a longer one. Someone put them together. He hadn't known about that. He kept his eyes on the road. What's the longer one? It has the whole thing. You talking. The helicopter going up. And then it has the statement that the CEO lady put out. She paused. She said nice things about you. She did. She said you were the most important person in the building, and nobody knew it. Another pause. Were you upset that she said that, because she didn't ask you first? He glanced at her. A little. I would be too. Zoe looked out the window. But I think she meant it. The way she wrote it, Ms. Patterson read it to some of the teachers in the hallway, and I heard it through the door. It didn't sound like someone trying to make themselves look good. It sounded like someone who was embarrassed. That's a perceptive reading of it. Mom used to say you can always tell the difference between someone apologizing to fix themselves and someone apologizing to fix what they broke. He kept his eyes on the road. Yeah, he said. She did say that. Which one is this? He thought about Victoria at 4 in the morning, drafting and redrafting. He thought about her on the phone at 7, calling Callahan to say she was wrong. He thought about the paragraph she had written in the conference room, 13 sentences, the one that had made Tom Reeves look at the middle distance. I think it's the second one, he said. I think she's trying to fix what she broke. Zoe absorbed this with the serious consideration she brought to things that mattered. Good, she said. Then maybe it'll actually get fixed. The board call lasted 3 hours. Victoria called him at 6:15 after Zoe had eaten dinner and retreated to her room with a book while Andre was doing the dishes, the specific meditative quality of dishwashing warm water, and the small satisfying completion of each clean plate. How did it go? He asked. The safety review is formally approved and fully funded. 3-week timeline for the Valkyrie independently verified. The board has agreed to establish the advisory position with direct executive reporting. She paused. 2 members resigned. They said the liability exposure changed the investment profile. I'm sorry. Don't be. I've known for 18 months that those 2 were going to become a problem. This accelerated the timeline. A brief pause. Robert Callahan is increasing his position by enough to offset the 2 who left plus a margin. Andre set a plate in the drying rack. There's one more thing, Victoria said. Her voice had a different quality than it had carried all day. Not the controlled professional tone, not the carefully contained something underneath, but something quieter, more exposed. The clip now has 9 million views. Someone cut it with a song. I won't describe it, you should see it, but its people are responding to it in a way I didn't anticipate. A pause. I've been reading the comments for the past hour, which I know is not something I should do, but I couldn't stop. And there are thousands of comments from people talking about their fathers, their grandfathers, men who served and came home and worked jobs that didn't reflect what they'd done or who they were. Women talking about their husbands, people talking about coworkers, neighbors, the maintenance man in their building who turned out to have a medical degree from another country. Her voice was careful and quiet. You broke something open, not just in the hangar, In people who watched 60 seconds of you standing still while a room laughed at you. Andre set the last dish in the rack. He dried his hands. Outside the kitchen window, the apartment complex was settling into its evening rhythm, lights and windows, the faint sound of a television, a dog barking once and then stopping. Diana would have said the story found the people who needed it, he said. Your wife. Yes. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Tell me about her. It was not a question he was usually asked. People who knew about Diana's death handled it with careful distance, sympathy, expressed once, and then given wide berth because grief made people uncomfortable, and loss was something most people preferred to acknowledge and move away from. Victoria asked it directly without preamble, in the voice of someone who genuinely wanted to know. He leaned against the kitchen counter. She was a high school English teacher, he said. 12th grade literature. She taught the same class for 11 years, and every year she said it was the first time because every class was different, and the books changed in her hands depending on who was reading them. He paused. She was louder than me. Funnier. She walked into rooms and immediately knew who in the room needed something, needed to be talked to, or needed to be left alone, or needed someone to make them laugh. She had a sense for people that I've never seen in anyone else. He stopped. Zoe has it. I can hear it when you talk about her, Victoria said. Zoe. She's her mother's daughter. And yours. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. And mine. Victoria didn't speak immediately. The silence had the quality of someone who is listening to something past the words in the space between them. I want to ask you something, she said finally. And you don't have to answer it now or ever if it's not something you want to discuss. Go ahead. Why maintenance? I understand the hours. I understand that it was about being present for Zoe, about predictability. But there are other jobs that offer predictable hours. You could have taught, consulted independently, instructed. A pause. Why the specific choice to be invisible? He had thought about this. He had thought about it for 3 years in the way that you think about the choices that formed your life, not constantly, and not with regret, but with the periodic honest attention that a decision of that magnitude deserves. I needed to not matter for a while, he said. She was quiet. After Diana died, after the funeral, and the paperwork, and the moving Zoe's things, and the reconfiguring of every single logistics of a life that had been built for 2 people into a life built for 1 parent and 1 child. I was so tired. He chose the words carefully. Not physically, not just that. I was tired of being someone who mattered in specific ways. In the Army, I was a pilot, which meant something particular. I was good at it, which meant something particular. That mattering had weight. And I was carrying Zoe's grief and my own grief, and I didn't have room for more weight. He paused. Maintenance was clean. I was responsible for the safety of the aircraft and nothing else. Nobody expected anything from me beyond that. Nobody was watching what I was or wasn't capable of. I could just do the work, be with Zoe, exist without performing. He stopped. I didn't plan to be there 3 years. I planned to be there 1 year, maybe 2, and then figure out the next thing. But Zoe got settled in her school, and Marcus's shift was predictable, and the 3:15 pickup became the organizing fact of my day, and I realized I had stopped thinking about the next thing entirely. Until the demonstration. Until the demonstration. Victoria was quiet for a long time. I've been performing since I was 17 years old, she said. Every room I've walked into since then has been a room I needed to matter in. I needed to be the smartest, the most prepared, the most certain. Her voice was careful and honest. I've built 3 companies on the back of that. I've also... She stopped. I've also made the mistake I made with you. Multiple times. I just didn't have an Andre Williams in the room to make it impossible to keep making it. You would have gotten there eventually. I don't know that. I do. He meant it. The 7-year-old interview. The thing you said about not knowing whether it was your failure or theirs. A pause. You found that. I read everything. Something moved through her voice that was close to a laugh, and close to something more serious. Yes, you do. A pause. I said that and then I went right back to surrounding myself with people who told me what I needed to hear, for 7 more years. Most people do. That's not an excuse. No, he agreed. It's not. But it's a true thing. And true things are where you start from. She was quiet again. Then, the advisory position. I want you to think about what it looks like from your side. Not from the board's framework, not from my proposal. From yours. What would actually make the aircraft safer? What would actually make the people in that building feel like their knowledge matters? Build it from there and bring it to me. A pause. Will you do that? He looked at the clean dishes in the drying rack. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. Check. I went to check on Zoe after the call. She was not reading. She was sitting at her desk with a sheet of paper and a pen, and when he knocked on the open door and looked in, she turned the paper over quickly with the specific speed of a child who does not want an adult to see what they're working on. What are you doing? Nothing. Zoe. She turned the paper back over. It was a drawing. Pencil 9-year-old skill level, but with a specificity of intention that made it immediately recognizable. A helicopter in the air, with a stick figure in the cockpit, who had drawn this detail carefully, a small badge or patch on one arm. And below on the ground, a crowd of stick figures with round open mouths, laughing. And one stick figure at the side standing apart, watching the helicopter. She had labeled it in her careful, slightly uneven printing, "My Dad." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Can I have that?" he asked. She looked at it, then at him. "It's not that good." "It's very good. I was going to make it better first. I want it now." She picked it up and held it out to him with the slightly reluctant expression of an artist releasing a work before they feel it's ready. He took it carefully. He looked at it for a moment. "Dad." "Yeah. Are you going to take the new job?" He looked up at her. "I don't know yet." "But you're thinking about it." "Yes." She considered this with her head tilted slightly, her mother's evaluating look. "What are you waiting for?" He looked at the drawing, at the helicopter in the air, at the crowd with the open mouths. "I want to make sure it's right," he said. "Not just for the company, for us." She nodded slowly. "Because of 315. Because of 315. She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the calm certainty of a person who has already thought this through more carefully than anyone knew. "Dad, I am going to be in middle school in 2 years, and I'm already pretty good at the bus." He looked at her. "I'm not saying 315 doesn't matter," she said. "I'm saying—" She paused, finding the words with the careful precision of someone who has been composing this speech in her head for longer than the conversation had been going on. "I'm saying that I know why 315 matters, and you know why 315 matters, and that doesn't go away if your job changes. It just means we figure out the new version of it." She met his eyes with her mother's directness. Mom didn't stop being mom when things changed. She just found the new version of how to be mom. Right? He couldn't speak for a moment. "Right," he managed. "So." She picked up her pen, turned back to her desk. "You should probably figure out what the new version looks like." He stood in the doorway for another moment, then he walked to the kitchen table. He sat down with his phone and a legal pad, the one with the coffee ring on the corner from this morning, and for the first time in 3 years, Andre Williams started writing not a maintenance report, and not a safety documentation, and not a letter he would fold and put in a truck. He started writing what it would actually look like. The advisory role, the safety culture, the framework for a building full of people whose knowledge needed to matter. He wrote for 2 hours. His handwriting was small and precise. The handwriting of a man who had been trained to record information accurately and completely, and he filled 6 pages without stopping. And when he stopped, it was not because he had run out of things to say, but because Zoe had come out of her room in her pajamas and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Dad, it's almost midnight." He looked up. "Go to bed," she said in the exact tone of voice he used with her. "You have work tomorrow." He looked at the 6 pages. "Yeah," he said, I do. He put the pen down. He folded the pages carefully and set them on the table under his coffee cup so they wouldn't move. He stood up, and his back ached the way it did when he'd been sitting without moving for too long, and he stretched and heard himself make the specific sound that men make when they are past 40 and have been sitting at kitchen tables for 2 hours. And Zoe made a face and said, "Old man." 9-year-old. She grinned her mother's grin, unguarded and total, and disappeared back into her room. He turned off the kitchen light. He stood in the dark for a moment. Outside the apartment complex was quiet. Whatever the world was doing with 9 million views and viral clips, and a story that Diana would have said was traveling to the people who needed it out there, it was doing that. In here. It was almost midnight, and his daughter was in her room, and he had 6 pages on the kitchen table, and tomorrow he had work. It had always been enough. And now, for the first time in 3 years, it was also the beginning of something. The 6 pages were still on the kitchen table when he woke up the next morning. He had not dreamed, which was unusual. Normally he was a dreamer, vivid, specific, the kind of dreams that had texture and weight, and sometimes followed him into the first hour of the morning like a second conversation running parallel to the waking one. But that night, he had slept the deep, uninterrupted sleep of someone whose body has finally been given permission to rest. And he woke at 5:15, feeling for the first time in longer than he could precisely identify like himself. Not the maintenance worker version of himself. Not the widower version. Not the viral clip version that 9 million people had apparently decided they knew something about. Just Andre Williams. 41 years old. Father. Pilot. Man who read everything and fixed things and showed up early and loved his daughter with a totality that had reorganized his entire existence. Haimad Coffee. Read back through the 6 pages. Made 7 small corrections in the margins. Then he put the pages in a manila folder he found in the kitchen drawer where he kept Zoe's school documents, and he set the folder by the door. He knocked on Zoe's door at 6:30. "I'm up," she said before he could say anything. She sounded entirely awake, which meant she had been up for a while. He pushed the door open. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed with a book, the one her class was reading. Something about a girl who discovers she can talk to animals, which Zoe had told him was scientifically implausible, but emotionally compelling. "How long have you been awake?" "Since 5. She looked at him over the top of the book. "I was thinking." "About what?" She set the book down. "About what I'm going to tell people at school, because Madison's going to ask, and Priya's going to ask, and Ms. Holloway is going to ask, and I want to know what I'm supposed to say." He sat on the edge of her bed. "What do you want to say?" She thought about it. "I want to say that my dad was always who he was and people just didn't know it yet. And now they do." She paused. "Is that too simple?" "No," he said. "That's exactly right." She picked the book back up. "Okay, then that's what I'll say." He stood. "Dad." "Yeah." "The folder by the door. Is that the plan you wrote last night?" "Yes." She went back to her book. "Good. I read some of it when I got up. It's really good." He looked at her. "You read my notes?" They were on the kitchen table. She did not look up. "You know I read everything." He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at his daughter, and thought about how Diana would have laughed at this, the specific full laugh she had for moments when the universe revealed its own continuity, when something about Zoe reflected something about Andre, reflected something about Diana herself in an unbroken chain of inheritance that death had interrupted but not severed. He would have given anything to hear that laugh one more time. But he had Zoe who read everything and said true things with absolute calm, and was already at 9 years old, more than either of them had fully expected her to become. That was enough. That was more than enough. "Get dressed," he said. "I'm making eggs." He arrived at the facility at 6:55. Victoria was already in the building. He could see her office light from the parking lot, but he didn't go up to the 4th floor. He went to the maintenance level. He went to his locker. He put on his uniform. Marcus was already there. They looked at each other for a moment. "You're still coming in as maintenance," Marcus said. "Until something changes officially, I'm maintenance." He opened his toolbox. "Bay 7. Bay 7's done. I need someone on the hydraulics check for the 412. It's been sitting in Bay 3 for 2 weeks waiting on parts that came in yesterday. I'll take it. Marcus handed him the work order, watched him take it, then said with the particular gruffness that was his version of warmth, "Whatever happens with the other thing, whatever title they put on the door, I hope you remember where you came from." Andre looked at him. "Marcus, I park in this cracked asphalt section every day because it's a habit now, and I don't see a reason to change." Marcus almost smiled. It was the closest he got. How was 2 hours into the hydraulics check when David came down to the maintenance level? David Chow did not come to the maintenance level often. Not because he was above it. David was not that kind of engineer, but because his work kept him on the upper floors near the design team and the simulation labs. When he appeared in the bay doorway in his regular clothes and his lanyard, it read as an event. Andre kept working. "I want to show you something," David said. He had his tablet. He held it out. On the screen was a spreadsheet dense with numbers, the kind of document that told a technical story in a language that required fluency to read. Andre wiped his hands on a rag and took the tablet. He read it. He read it again. "This is the full safety incident history," he said, "going back 8 years. Every flag, every override, every instance where a documented concern was escalated and then either resolved or—" David paused. "Managed around." He let Andre read for another moment. "I've been compiling this for the past 2 days, since the demonstration, because I needed to understand the pattern." He took the tablet back. "There are 11 instances in 8 years where documented safety concerns were overridden at the executive level for schedule or investor reasons. 11. The tail rotor issue was the 12th. Andre stood up from the aircraft. "Of the 11 previous instances," David continued, 7 resulted in additional maintenance delays. 3 resulted in near incidents that were internally classified and not reported to the FAA. 1. He stopped. His jaw tightened. 1 resulted in a minor accident during a demonstration in 2021 that was publicly attributed to pilot error. The bay was quiet. Was it pilot error? No. The word was flat and final. It was a known hydraulic issue that had been flagged 2 weeks earlier and cleared for flight anyway. The pilot was a contractor. He signed an NDA. David looked at the tablet in his hands. He left aviation after that. Andre looked at the aircraft beside him. The Bell 412, reliable and unglamorous 20 years old. The kind of aircraft that nobody made viral videos about. He thought about the contractor who had signed an NDA. He thought about the maintenance workers who had written the original flag. He thought about all the reports that had been filed and folded and put in metaphorical trucks. "This goes in the board package," Andre said. "I've already sent it to Victoria." And she read it at 8 o'clock this morning. She called legal immediately after. He paused. "She called me after that. She was—" He searched for the word. She was not defending herself. She was asking what we needed to do to make it right. "The contractor. She's already trying to locate him." Andre was quiet. "There's something else," David said. He set the tablet on the workbench and picked it back up, the gesture of a man managing something he is uncertain how to deliver. "The FAA reached out this morning. Not in response to anything we filed. In response to the clip." He looked at Andre. "Apparently the clip has people talking in enough relevant circles that the FAA's Aviation Safety Office made an inquiry. Victoria has a call with them this afternoon." He paused. "She wants you on the call." Andre looked at him. "I'm maintenance, David. You were maintenance." David held his gaze. "The board formally approved the advisory position this morning, 8:15. I got the notification 20 minutes ago." He paused. "Technically, as of 8:15 this morning, you are Horizon Aviation's Director of Flight Safety and Operations, with direct executive reporting independent authority to ground aircraft and—" He stopped again. The careful pause of a man delivering a list he has memorized. A schedule that has been explicitly structured to accommodate a 3:15 school pickup. Andre stood very still. "Victoria had that written into the position description herself," David said. "The specific language. I watched her write it. He paused. She said, and I'm quoting directly because I wrote it down, "This organization will structure itself around the people who make it worth trusting. We'll figure out the rest." Andre looked at the Bell 412 beside him. At the hydraulics line he'd been checking. At his toolbox open on the workbench, the tools arranged the way he'd arranged them every working day for 3 years. He thought about Sergeant First Class Delroy Burkett telling him that the fire was good if he could control it. He thought about Diana saying stories travel to the people who need them. He thought about Tom Reeves standing with his arms crossed in a hangar, paying the price of telling the truth. He thought about Zoe cross-legged on her bed at 5 in the morning, reading his notes, telling him with absolute calm that she was getting pretty good at the bus. "Tell Victoria I'll be on the call at 2, he said. David exhaled. It was a small sound, but it was the sound of something released. "One more thing," David said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. Plain white, no markings. "This came to the facility this morning. Someone dropped it at the front desk and left before the receptionist could get a name." He held it out. Andre opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in the careful printing of someone who had not written by hand in a while and was being deliberate about it. "Mr. Williams, I was in that hangar. I am one of the engineers who knew about the rotor issue and said nothing. I told myself it was not my place and that someone above me would handle it. I watched Tom Reeves walk out, and I didn't say a word. I've been with this company for 4 years, and I have a mortgage and a kid in college, and I made a calculation every time I stayed quiet that I am ashamed of now. I don't know if this changes anything. But I wanted you to know that what you did standing up in front of that room, it didn't just change things at Horizon. It changed something in me. I'm not going to stay quiet anymore. I don't know what that costs yet, but I think I'm ready to pay it. M." He read it twice, folded it, put it in his chest pocket next to where he kept the folded drawing Zoe had given him. He picked up his toolbox. "I'm going to finish the hydraulics check," he said. "Then I'll come upstairs." David nodded. He understood Andre thought that the hydraulics check was not about the helicopter, that finishing what you started was not a metaphor, but a practice, and that the practice was the thing. The FAA call lasted 90 minutes. Andre sat at the conference table on the 4th floor for the first time without a work order in his hand, and without the sense of being somewhere he did not belong. The feeling of not belonging had not entirely disappeared. It was the kind of thing that took time to renegotiate the body's accumulated knowledge of where it fit and where it didn't, but it was quieter than it had been. He presented the documentation. The full 8-year safety history that David had compiled, his own technical assessment of the Valkyrie's rotor issue, the repair timeline, the framework for the advisory position, and what independent safety reporting would look like going forward. The FAA representative, a woman named Kathleen Morris, 20 years in aviation safety, the kind of voice that asked specific questions and listened to the complete answer. Before asking the next one, responded in the measured technical way of someone who had heard many things in her career and was currently hearing something she had not expected to hear. "Mr. Williams," she said at a pause in the presentation, "you've been in this facility for 3 years. "Yes. And the documentation you're presenting the safety flags that were overridden the historical pattern this was accumulated during that time." "Most of it. Some predates my time here." David Chow compiled the full history. "You flagged the tail rotor issue 4 months ago. In writing, it was not escalated." A pause. "And your role at the time of the demonstration was maintenance technician." "Yes." Another pause, this one longer. "Ms. Ashford." Victoria looked toward the phone in the center of the table. "I want to be direct with you about what I'm looking at. This is a systemic documentation issue with a pattern long enough and consistent enough that it will require a formal safety review, not an internal one. We'll be in contact with your legal team about the process." A pause. "I also want to say something that is outside my formal role and is simply my own observation." "Go ahead," Victoria said. "What you're doing here, bringing this documentation forward, voluntarily establishing an independent safety advisory with genuine authority. Putting this on record before we came to you. That is not the behavior of an organization that is trying to manage a problem. That is the behavior of an organization that is trying to fix one. A pause. In 20 years I have not seen that as often as I would like to. I'm noting it. The call ended. The room was quiet. Tom Reeves, who had been on the call for the technical sections, leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "Well," he said. "There it is." Victoria was looking at the table. Her hands were flat on the surface in front of her, the same gesture Andre had seen from David 2 days ago, the gesture of someone doing an accounting. "Are you all right?" Andre asked. She looked up at him. "I've been running companies for 16 years, she said. "I have never—" She stopped, started again. "I have never sat in a room and voluntarily handed a regulator a document that detailed 16 years of my industry's systemic failures and 8 years of my own company's contributions to them." She paused. "It was the right thing to do. I know it was the right thing to do." A pause. "It was also the most frightening thing I have done in a professional context in my adult life." "More frightening than MIT at 17, Tom asked. Something moved across her face that was the beginning of a real laugh, surprised out of her. "Slightly less frightening than MIT at 17. She looked at Andre. "Slightly." He held her gaze for a moment. "The contractor from 2021, he said. Her expression changed. The edge of something that was not quite guilt and not quite grief. "Legal found him. His name is James Whitfield. He's been working in construction for the last 3 years. He lives in Phoenix." She paused. "I'm going to call him myself." "When?" "Tonight." She said it with the flatness of someone who has already decided and does not need it validated. "Whatever the legal team recommends about the NDA and the liability and the disclosure process, I'm calling him tonight. As a person, not as a CEO." She looked down at her hands. "He deserves to hear a human voice say that what happened to him was wrong." Andre nodded. "I thought about James Whitfield in Phoenix doing construction work with a story he'd been legally prevented from telling. He thought about the specific silence of an NDA. Not just the external silence, the legal prohibition, but the internal silence that accumulated when you carried something and could not put it down and could not give it to anyone. He thought about his own 3 years of walking through a side entrance that required you to knock. Different silences. Same cost. "Tell him I'll fly with him," Andre said. "Whenever he wants. If he wants to go back up. Tell him that offer is open." Victoria looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has not stopped being surprised by this man and has accepted that this is simply how it was going to be. "I'll tell him," she said. The story broke nationally the following Monday, not the clip. The clip had been circulating for days. Already had been picked up by enough accounts, with enough reach, that it had moved past viral and into something more permanent, the kind of story that gets referenced rather than just watched. The Monday story was the full piece published by a journalist who had spent a week talking to sources inside and outside Horizon Aviation, and had produced something that was by any measure careful and honest and complete. Andre read it at the kitchen table before Zoe woke up. It was accurate. That was the first thing he checked reflexively, the way he checked instruments, not out of distrust, but out of the habit of verification. The details were correct. The timeline was correct. The quotes attributed to him were from the conversation he'd had with the journalist 2 days earlier. A conversation he had agreed to on the condition that Zoe not be named or photographed, a condition that had been honored. The piece did not describe him as a hero. It described him as a maintenance worker who had been a military pilot who had made a choice that most people would not have understood who had spoken, when silence was easier, and who had done so, not for recognition, but because the aircraft was not safe, and people might have gotten hurt. It described Victoria with the same honesty. The mistake and the correction. The 4 a.m. statement, and the FAA call, and the search for James Whitfield. It described David Chow and Tom Reeves. It described the 8-year safety history that was now the subject of a formal FAA review. Near the end, there was a paragraph that he read twice. The journalist had spoken to Robert Callahan, who had said without apparent concern for how it reflected on the institutional logic of investing. The most important person in that building was parking in the cracked section of the lot and walking through a side entrance every day for 3 years. That's not a story about one man. That's a story about how organizations decide who counts, and what it costs when they get that wrong. Andre set the paper down. Zoe appeared in the kitchen doorway in her school uniform, hair not yet done, evaluating the situation with the quick assessment of someone who reads rooms. The article, yes. She came and read over his shoulder, which required her to stand on her tiptoes. She read quietly for a minute. They didn't put my name in, she said. No. Good. She straightened up. Can you do my braid, the regular one, not the complicated one? He pushed back from the table. She sat on the kitchen chair in front of him, and he braided her hair with the practiced, careful hands of a man who had learned to do this at age 32, watching YouTube videos in a hospital waiting room while his wife was in treatment and their daughter needed her hair done and there was nobody else. He had not been good at it at first. He was very good at it now. Dad, Zoe said while he worked. Yeah, when the new job really starts. She paused. What does a normal day look like? He thought about this. About the 6 pages in the manila folder. About the framework he had presented to the board and to the FAA. About what it actually meant to build a safety culture rather than just document the absence of one. Meetings, he said. Documentation. Reviewing flight data. Talking to pilots and engineers and maintenance workers about what they're seeing that nobody's asking them about. He secured the end of the braid. And pick up at 3:15. She reached back and felt the braid, satisfied. That sounds good, she said. She slid off the chair and went to get her backpack. He sat at the kitchen table for another moment. He thought about the letter in his chest pocket. M, who was not going to stay quiet anymore and did not know yet what it would cost. He thought about James Whitfield in Phoenix, who was going to get a phone call tonight from a CEO saying that what happened to him was wrong. He thought about Tom Reeves back in a flight suit going through a pre-flight on the Valkyrie with the Independence to say not yet and have it mean something. I thought about all the maintenance levels, in all the facilities, in all the industries, where people with knowledge were walking through side entrances every day and being told in 100 different ways that their role was to keep things clean and let the people with degrees worry about the rest. He could not fix all of it. He knew that with the clarity of a man who had spent 11 years in situations that required the ability to assess what was possible and what was not, and to act decisively on the former without wasting energy on the latter. He could not fix all of it. But he could fix what was in front of him. He could show up. He could read everything. He could finish what he started. He could be home at 3:15. 3 weeks later, the Valkyrie flew. The rotor issue had been resolved, genuinely resolved with independent verification, with Tom Reeves in the cockpit and the FAA's regional representative on the ground, and a small group of the investor consortium watching from a safe perimeter, and with no cameras arranged by the marketing department, no branded napkins, no crowd calibrated for maximum impact. Just the aircraft and the pilot and the people who had made her safe. Andre stood on the tarmac and watched her go up. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and his field watch on his wrist, and he was not in the cockpit, and he did not need to be. He had been in the cockpit. He had proven what he needed to prove to himself, and to whoever else needed to see it 3 weeks ago in front of an audience that had expected something entirely different. Now he was where he was supposed to be, watching, evaluating, making sure. Tom's voice came over the radio, calm, professional, the voice of a man who trusted the machine, because the machine had been made trustworthy. Horizon 1 airborne. Systems nominal. David was standing 3 feet away, watching the aircraft climb with the expression of an engineer, watching something he built finally do what it was designed to do. She's beautiful, he said quietly. She is, Andre agreed. Victoria was on his other side. She had been quiet since the rotor started turning the particular silence of someone who is feeling something they do not have words for yet and is not going to reach for inadequate ones. When this Valkyrie leveled off and turned south in a clean banking arc against the sky, she said, I called James Whitfield last Thursday. Andre looked at her. We talked for 2 hours, she said. He didn't say much at first. I don't think he believed it was actually me. She watched the aircraft. He said he had spent 3 years thinking it was his fault. That if he had just been a better pilot, if he had handled the hydraulics better, if he had... She stopped. Her jaw was tight. He genuinely believed it was his fault. Because that's what the NDA implied. Because that's what the silence implied. She paused. I told him it was not his fault. I told him specifically in detail what the maintenance logs had shown. I told him that his judgment had been correct, and that the people with the authority to listen had chosen not to. She paused again. He cried, on the phone. I sat there and let him because there was nothing else to do. Andre was quiet. He's going to come to Phoenix next month, she said. Not for anything official. Just he wants to see the aircraft. He wants to see what it looks like when it's done right. She glanced at Andre. I told him you offered to fly with him. What did he say? He said yes. He said yes immediately. Something moved through her voice. He's been thinking about whether he could go back for 3 years, and he said yes before I finished the sentence. The Valkyrie turned north now. Tom bringing her around in a wide, easy arc. The kind of arc that said the aircraft had room, and the pilot had confidence, and the sky was not a threat, but a home. Andre watched her. He thought about 4,200 hours. About the hands that remember. About the way the body holds what the mind might forget. He thought about James Whitfield saying yes before the sentence was finished. Good, he said. Victoria looked at the aircraft for another moment. Then she said quietly, and without preamble, the way she had learned to say things that mattered. Thank you, for not walking away, for coming back the next morning, for... She stopped. Found the right words, which were also the simple ones. For being the kind of person who finishes what they start. He looked at her. Thank you, he said, for being the kind of person who can be wrong and say so. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the sky where the Valkyrie was turning again, clean and precise, and exactly what she had always been capable of being when the people responsible for her finally got out of her way and let her become it. At 3:15, Andre Williams pulled his truck out of the Horizon Aviation parking lot. Not the cracked asphalt section. He had moved his parking space the previous week not as a statement and not as a performance, but because the old space was a 20-minute walk from the building entrance, and a man with a 3:15 commitment does not waste 20 minutes on sentiment. He drove the familiar route. Earl was in his folding chair outside the school gate, eating his sandwich, wearing the tan jacket. He waved without looking up. Andre waved back. Zoe came through the gate fast, same as always, but stopped when she cleared the crowd of students and found his truck. She stood for a moment and looked at him through the windshield with her mother's eyes steady and certain and full. Then she came to the truck and climbed in. She buckled her seatbelt. She looked at him. How was the day? He asked. Ms. Holloway let me read a story I wrote about you, she said. In front of the class. He pulled out of the lot. What did you write? She reached into her backpack and produced 2 folded pages. She unfolded them with the care of someone handling something that matters. She cleared her throat. She read. It was 9-year-old writing imperfect grammar. Some run-on sentences. The occasional spelling that had been corrected and then second-guessed and corrected again. But underneath the imperfections was something that could not have been more precisely true. She had written about a man who was always who he was, even when nobody knew it. About a man who chose love over pride and called it the easiest decision he ever made. About a man who fixed things aircraft problems, the specific and ongoing damage that happened when people with knowledge were not listened to, with the same steady hands he used to braid his daughter's hair every morning. She had written, My dad says the job is always to make sure people get home safe. I think that is what he has always been doing, no matter what his title was. She folded the pages. She put them back in her backpack. She looked out the window at the city going past. Andre drove. His throat was tight. He did not try to speak for a block and a half until he was certain he could do it cleanly. What did the class think? Madison cried, Zoe said. Just a little. She tried to hide it. What about you? Did you cry? Dad? She looked at him with the expression that meant the question was slightly beneath the dignity of the answer. I wrote it. I already did the crying part. He laughed. It came out whole and real, the kind of laugh that arrives without warning and means something. She grinned. Her mother's grin. Unguarded and total. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the way they drove when nothing needed to be said, because everything important had already been said, or was understood, without saying, or was written in 9-year-old handwriting in a backpack between them. Andre Williams had not been invisible for 3 years. He had simply been waiting with the patience of a man who trusted that the moment would come, when what he carried would be needed, and that when it came, he would be ready. He had been ready. He had always been ready. And now, on the other side of everything that had happened, the joke and the silence and the aircraft lifting from the hangar floor and the 6 pages and the FAA call and James Whitfield saying yes before the sentence was finished, and Zoe reading 2 pages to a classroom and making Madison cry just a little on the other side of all of it. Andre Williams was still exactly who he had always been. A man who showed up, who read everything, who finished what he started, who knew that the most important flight he had ever taken was not the one that silenced a room full of laughing people. It was the 3:15 pickup every day, without exception, in a 12-year-old truck for a daughter who already knew everything she needed